Hello, welcome to another episode of the Black Etc. podcast, a podcast about how ideas and culture spread amongst Black folks, especially outside mass media. I'm your host, Ian Youssef. My guest today is Dr. Jared Ball, who's a professor of Africana and Communication Studies at Morgan State University. He's also a writer and activist. I talked to him mostly about his book, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. Dr. Ball was one of the first people who I recorded with. I think this episode is really important. You will probably come to understand that Dr. Ball's argument about Black buying power puts him directly at odds with a number of my other guests in terms of the efficacy of buying Black enterprise, and Black media. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I strongly believe that we as Black people have to have a broader range of voices and ideas in the public discourse than we have now. We have to be willing to challenge orthodoxies, even ones that are popular across the political spectrum. In the case of my discussion with Dr. Ball, that idea is that Black buying power is real, Black buying power is empowering, and it's something that we should organize around. I had considered talking about this in the lessons portion of the episode, but actually I already knew this, and it was one of the reasons I reached out to Dr. Ball. Since definitely the 90s and probably the 80s as well, left or more radical Black voices have been systematically silenced and removed from public space, even popular Black media. And I think our community is poorer for it. Dr. Ball and I touched on this in our discussion, where I brought up the Black Journal leader roundtables from the 70s hosted by Tony Brown, and just the breadth of voices from radical to more conservative that were in conversation in public back then, and how that's no longer the case. So yeah, I thought this was not only a great episode in itself, but for what it represents in terms of expanding ideas and voices in Black discourse. I'm joined today by Dr. Jared Ball, writer, activist, professor of Africana and Communication Studies at Morgan State University. He's the author of The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. He also wrote the book, I Mix What I Like, and hosts a podcast by the same name. He's an independent media advocate and one of the founders of Black Power Media. Welcome, Dr. Ball. Thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. And just a quick, not necessarily correction, but addition. I am also a co-founder and a collaborator with Black Liberation Media. Just want to make sure folks can find that group as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So today I want to focus mostly on your book, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, which is in its second edition, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah, so the first question is twofold. What prompted you to write the book? And what is your central argument surrounding the idea of Black buying power?
Well, what prompted the writing of the book was just years of being primarily an activist, and then some academic and journalistic spaces where the mythology or the claim that Black people have what's now said to be approaching $2 trillion in buying power. And if the community were to use it more responsibly and with greater degrees of so-called financial literacy, the economy could be made to work for Black people and allow the community to do things, as they say, in terms of the cliche and the buzzword, generate, quote, generational wealth, or close the so-called wealth divide. And so, and my central claim is that the concept of buying power is misunderstood, and it has been, in fact, weaponized against Black communities for at least the last 30 years as a subset of the equally weaponized narrative around Black capitalism, which has been in existence much longer, and which argues that, again, Black people don't need political power or radical politics just simply to do better with financial literacy and can organize themselves and improve themselves collectively, materially through business and entrepreneurialism.
Based on your research, what are some of the earliest or most notable examples of Black buying power in the public discourse?
Well, the version that we deal with to this day really emanated or was sort of reorganized and represented in the early 1990s by the Selig Center for Economic Growth based out of Georgia, and which by its own literature says its primary goal is to help the business community of the state of Georgia improve its ability to advertise and promote itself and, of course, to generate revenue. But because of its repackaging and distribution and then misunderstanding and misrepresentation in Black media spaces and in certain segments of Black academic and activist circles, the mythology was grafted on to the pre-existing narrative around Black capitalism. And again, as I said, meant to falsely present this idea that Black people are poor largely because of the self-determined or self-driven choices that they've made, when in fact the Black community, as is all other communities, are held in various stages of poverty and inequality through a variation of structural violence, capitalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism. It's by design, and again has nothing to do with the so-called poor choices or lack of financial literacy of the Black community. So that's really the work that I've been trying to demonstrate and to show that there is a legacy, a lineage to the claim. There is a politics to the claim. There is a pathway that we can demonstrate and map that shows how the mythology was generated, its original purpose, and then how it has been weaponized against the Black community through, again, a lot of misrepresentation and an unfortunate incestuous business relationship between commercial media, even the Black press, and the corporate advertising world that drives and determines the content of all mainstream commercial media in the United States. So, and then therefore what happens is the Black commercial press wanting to promote itself to white advertisers as being able to deliver to those white advertisers endless amounts of Black consumers who will buy the products that those white advertisers want to pay to advertise. The Black press ends up promoting this mythology to its own Black audiences, that there is this buying power that can, on the one hand, be used to overturn centuries of oppression and imposed inequality, but at the same time be said to be enough to generate the kind of revenue and rate of return on the advertising dollar spent by white corporations. So it's a contradiction. It's a conundrum that produces just a lot of confusion and fails to help Black people understand how the economy works or what the relationship Black people have to the economy. And then ultimately it limits what is argued can be done by the Black community to change its relationship, liberate itself, or actually improve the material conditions of the entire community.
So you mentioned in your book, E. Franklin Frazier's Black Bourgeoisie, Earl Afari Hutchinson's Myth of Black Capitalism, and others. What are some other works that influenced your analysis?
Well, I mean, there's a lot from the arguments of Malcolm X to the arguments around socialism and redistribution that have been argued by a lot of people from the Black Panther Party to the Revolutionary Action Movement to all really the entire Black radical tradition. And add to that a little bit of an analysis coming out of the radical European tradition, Marxism, and critiques of capitalism. And I think you pretty much get where it is I'm coming from. And again, really, you know, as I say all the time, the only luminary that I'm aware of who was always correct on this argument around buying power, because there were so many who were confused at various times in their lives around the claim, was George Jackson. And George Jackson, whose work Blood in My Eye, more than anything really at this point, is a work that has led me to not only better understand the history and relationship to the economy that Black people have in this country, but again, what can be done to change it. And it does not include any form of engagement with Black capitalism or entrepreneurialism, and does not include, in terms of an analysis, any consideration that Black people are poor because Black people are somehow culturally, politically, socially, cognitively deficient. It's just none of that is real and has absolutely nothing to do with the conditions facing Black people. So that's just some of it, but I would encourage folks to read the book and to check out the endless hours of video and audio content that I've produced on the subject, and they can learn much more about the sources and the way the argument is developed and supported.
What were the main ways, or let's say the media through which this myth was propagated in the early part or first half of the 20th century, I'd say?
Well, buying power, it was propagated largely again through a variety of commercial press outlets, including the black press, which led to even a lot of black radicals at various stages of their life. And I talk a little bit about it in the book. I mean, this is one of the few things that both Du Bois and Garvey agreed on. This is something Malcolm X had claimed at one point, and many others. But because, as I was saying, the argument was born, the introduction to the idea that black people have this pool of circulatable resources that could be used to, instead of going out to the white community, go inward to the black community and help the black community advance. That argument is old and predates really the end of enslavement, but certainly was ramped up after the end of official enslavement. And then certainly as various stages of relative freedom were evolved, and there was the evolution of the commercial press, the black press included, which has then and now always been dependent on advertising revenue to sustain itself. There became a sort of a corruption of the analysis and interpretation of how the economy works and what black people's, again, relationship is to it. So the argument began very early on that if just thinking broadly and at a very surface level, well, if we don't shop over there and shop over here, the money that we spend over there would be kept over here and would help the community. But there are many problems with that have everything to do with what products black people are able to produce and sell, what is the relationship to investment capital and the broader economy, how a resource is going to be delivered and brought in and then turned into marketable, saleable, consumable products, and then sold at enough of a rate to enough people to generate enough wealth that could then be redistributed back to the community. These were not really thought through. And at the end of the day, to make it plain, the problem is if you have a poor community that is earning to this day 15 cents on the white dollar, to target that community with a limited amount of goods that they can afford and suggest that that can lead to a sizable pool of resources that can challenge the vast amounts of unequal and accumulated wealth that exists in this country and around the world is just, again, mythology and part of the propaganda that is meant to keep black people from raising the important questions around political power, redistribution, how capitalism as an economy works, how exploitation within that system works, and what then should be done as a response. And that's part of what I'm trying to challenge and encourage black communities to reconsider.
In what ways did corporate consolidation of media companies around the 80s or so help this myth to spread?
Well, I mean, it's just as is the case with any, that once you have fewer people with greater reach, all vying for not only the same audience, but the same ad revenue, it just makes it easier to not only develop a narrative, but have that narrative be distributed because there are fewer layers to go through. So, as is the case with the consolidation of the music industry and its impact on popular music, the consolidation of publication and its impact on scholarship and journalism. The same is the case here, that once you have a handful of corporations, themselves subsidiaries of private equity groups that have themselves accrued so much more of the global economy within their catalogs or within their portfolios, it's just easier to disseminate the narrow range of messaging, which is just simply that capitalism is good, communism is bad, black nationalism is bad, radical traditions are unnecessary, and people in general are poor because there's something wrong with them. And that we should just wait for the superheroic corporation or, white man in the Orasami Burton capitalized sense of the phrase, and we'll be good. And it's been successful.
Yeah, you talk about the narrow range of ideas in black public discourse. I often peruse YouTube for old clips of Black roundtables and such. And I was looking at the one from 72 and 73, Black Journal, hosted by Tony Brown, who is known later as more of a Black business, entrepreneurship, Black enterprise type. But those roundtables had Kwame Ture, Angela Davis, and a lot of people who I did not expect to see on like PBS on a mainstream Black public affairs program. But that just goes to show the range of ideas has been shrunk down. You wouldn't expect that today, that kind of broad range of people, especially the people on the left.
No, I mean, and this is by design. I mean, there was even discussions that targeted the late Amiri Baraka as someone who represented the kind of politics that the commercial press was going to ignore going forward, right around by the end of the 80s into the early 90s. So there was a concerted effort to move away. And once the movements that radicalism had produced were largely suppressed and the political prisoners generated and safely confined into their cells, largely to be ignored to this day, it made it easier in that consolidated media environment to reset the narrative and in a very conscious way move Black people away from collective political radicalism to individual entrepreneurial capitalistic endeavors. So today, in terms of the mainstream, we definitely don't see the range of radical white or Black or any other thought that would have been on the air 30, 40, 50 years ago. But that's also, again, commensurate or it runs parallel to the absence or the lack of the kinds of organized and militant movements that were in the streets at that time. And that's something that has to be considered, that there is a relationship between movements in the street, so to speak, and what happens on even commercial media outlets. So, yeah, just something to consider.
You mentioned earlier commercial media and culture. As a hip-hop head and scholar, you've explored how the music plays a role in popularizing not only the idea of Black buying power, but more generally, as you say, Black capitalism, trickle-down liberation, that kind of thing. As a genre that was once associated with the poor, with the downtrodden, how did that happen?
In much the same way we've been talking about here. Once the music industry readjusted itself to this emergent cultural expression, eventually described as hip hop, it got plugged into a system that already existed to wipe out radicalism and all other forms of cultural expression. And it had been going back to the dawn of the era of sheet music in the pre-technological recording era. That is the need to manage and manipulate the popular form that the expression of oppressed peoples take. And once it was clear that there's this rap music and hip hop culture, broadly speaking, that had progressive and even radical elements to it and politics to it, the industry just reorganized itself. And through the consolidation, sometimes attributed to the 1996 Telecommunications Act, but also which allowed for one corporate entity or one individual to own more media of various types in given areas. It allowed for the kind of consolidation that led to the massive rise of Clear Channel and radio and the consolidation more broadly within the music industry, leading to where we are today with basically 3 labels and 3 platforms that determine all the popularity in music, regardless of genre. All of that allowed for there to be just simply through signing, what contracts were offered, what was allowable through sampling, for the corporate world to determine what forms that the art would take sonically in terms of, just how it would sound and who would get to be able to say what and with what access to what levels of audience. And today there's basically 1 or 2 companies that determine all the access to stages, that determine all the contracts that go, major contracts that determine how many streams people get. There's just really a handful of companies that determine all of this. And that is what we see today is the end result of that process. And this is why people see that, many people can't afford to go see the artists they want to see, and why a lot of artists that are not super mega stars still struggle to sell out even, first of all, they can't afford to get into the bigger venues and sell those out. And they even struggle to sell out what is a dwindling amount of mid-level event spaces and performance spaces to access. So what the end result is a very manicured, corporate friendly, settler colonial friendly version of popular version of the art. And anything that might be more meaningful or threatening ideologically is left to fight against all the massive amounts of media that's out there without any promotion or distribution or platforming. And so, what we see today is the logical culmination of this long process, and why so few today are being inspired to radicalism or critical thinking through popular art.
The book and the argument has been, I think, very well received. A lot of people are excited about it, but there are some people who are extremely angry about it, it seems. Among them, Julianne Malveaux, the economist, and I think she's a president of a college, and Killer Mike, the rapper. Why do you think the pushback against your critique of Black buying power has been so intense?
First, we should note that there's no evidence that these loud critics have even read the book. So I just want to be clear about that. And what I think that speaks to is that what the argument I'm pointing to, and if they do read it, is made somewhat clear, although not as explicit as I could have made it. But what the underlying message is that we need more radical solutions than many in the Black middle class, Black bourgeoisie, and certainly in the broader world are interested in. That the argument I'm making challenges and threatens a lot of the spaces that have promoted them and that have welcomed variations of entrepreneurial and Black capitalist politics, and which are happy to leave the discussion going no farther left than the Democratic Party. So the why they do is I would have to speculate, and I think it is that they're really having a visceral reaction to the narrative threat that my argument represents to their own. And their narrative is one that I've argued has been established as propaganda and psychological warfare that has been willfully constructed to encourage, again, that there be a Black middle class and that this Black bourgeoisie set the tone for what Black politics will be going forward. And this has always been a conflict within Black liberation and other liberation struggles. Mm-hmm. This is the conflict that Dr. King struggled with against those in the civil rights establishment who had, at the end of his life, turned on him. This is the struggle that the Black Power movement represented to a certain segment of the Black elite. This is a threat that hip hop represented to early on to the Black bourgeoisie who were not interested in rap music being incorporated into Black radio and Black media and thought it was a poor representation of the Black community. Because it was itself, again, a challenge and a reminder that the claims that the Black middle class and the existence of a Black bourgeoisie would somehow benefit the community. And even predating that, as I talk about a little bit in my own work, the argument around buying power has always been one as a subset of Black capitalism that has meant to support ultimately, again, a Black bourgeoisie. This is the fundamental nature of the claim of E. Franklin Frazier and Abram Harris and others who were saying for a long time that all Black business does at best is create an exploitive segment of the Black community, taking advantage of the rest of the collective. So that's what I think that they're well rewarded. A lot of the critics some of that you've named and others, they're well rewarded by a system that produces a Black middle class and bourgeoisie. And they are having, I think, a visceral reaction as aspirants to that class or that segment of the community to the argument I'm making. And so I always just think it's important that people be reminded that to just think about methodologically, how are the arguments that they're hearing being made? And that's ultimately where my book comes from. That is a critique of Where are these claims coming from that a community as poor and exploited as the Black community somehow has this buying power that it's ignorantly misusing? Where is that coming from? And when you lift the hood, as I did, again, what I've done is seminal in that no one had ever done it, apparently, but it's not some unaccomplishable, unparalleled act of scholarship that I've produced here. It's just simply lifting up the hood. So I'm asking other people to do the same thing. Lift up the hood on the claims that are being made to you and ask questions about where they're coming from. And what I've shown with the buying power mythology is that the many who make it, as with those critics you named and others who wanted to condemn my work without reading it or engaging it, they are simply regurgitating numbers and claims that have no basis in fact and are only there to prop up a system that at most benefits a handful and exploits and punishes the rest. So I encourage people not to take my word for it, to investigate my work and its claims and do that with those of my detractors. And I am fully confident that anyone who does that will see what I did, which is that, to put it as was once done as some of these, back in the day, these claims are fugazi. They're not real.
I can see why the Black media and economic elite, the people you talk about, they benefit from the myth and they have a pushback. But you've also said that the myth is popular across the political spectrum, and even people on the left also engage and believe in this myth. So what incentive do they have? Why would they accept this myth?
Well, again, even well-meaning people haven't looked at the claim. Mm-hmm. So they hear a claim that Black people have almost $2 trillion in buying power. And if you're on the right, you're thinking, wow, I can get a whole bunch of that and live rich. If you're on the left, you're thinking, I can redistribute a whole bunch of that and heal the community. And in each case, both are missing the fact that those numbers are based on nothing. They're based on estimates and projections, to quote the reports themselves. They're based on claims that are meant to attract ad revenue. Mm-hmm. They're not meant to explain the economic condition of Black people and what can be done about it. So it's, again, well-meaning people will take a myth and propaganda and try to do something good with it. And all they end up doing is falsely, even unwittingly, inadvertently, but falsely representing and redistributing a bad concept, a flawed concept, a misunderstood concept, and trying to develop something good out of it. Mm-hmm. And even if you're trying to do something good, if you cannot build something solid on a fraudulent, faulty foundation. Mm-hmm. So that's in large part, those were the spaces I was in where I was hearing this claim. That's one of the reasons why many years ago I wanted to start to raise questions about it, because it didn't make sense. But again, once I identified the claim's origins and saw and could map out its distribution and point to some of the key spokespeople, even well-meaning spokespeople promoting the mythology, once I could see that, and then I was maybe, I think, a little naive in my optimism, but once I saw what I saw and then thought I could, as I did, write it all down and explain and walk people through it, I thought it would have more of an impact. I had hoped it would have more of an impact in getting Black community to adjust its course in terms of the conversations it was having around the economic condition we're in. But I was naive regarding the extent to which the myth, I thought the myth could be dislodged. And I was naive, certainly naive about the willingness, ability, and success to a certain extent that some detractors would be able to get away with. That is, yeah, I was naive in not considering the extent to which people would be not only hostile to my argument, but fraudulently engage it, be willing to fraudulently engage it, which has been a little bit of a surprise.
You talk about the economic myths, again, Black buying power, buy Black, entrepreneurship will help. If we just buy land, if we just buy real estate, financial literacy, all of this stuff. But I also think there's these approaches or these ideas in different realms, right? So in the cultural realm, it's respectability, get married, go to church, pull up your pants, get an education, that kind of stuff. Or even electoralism in the political realm, vote X or Y party, withhold your vote, To me, that suggests that it's broader, that there's some kind of broad work or need that this myth is fulfilling. Also, there's a culture, I think, of empowerment fantasy. I think Fraser talked about delusion, when people who are oppressed want to give themselves hope or feel that they have control over a desperate situation. To me, I feel like that's somewhat of what's going on here, and why the myth may have some legs beyond the just kind of factual claims. Given your commitment to combating the myth in terms of fact, how do you deal with the research that says that most people who believe misinformation aren't swayed by facts, especially when they have a deep commitment to the myth?
Yeah, I mean, so I cite some of it in my book. I mean, I get it. And even as I cite it, I'm still saying I was naive to the extent I thought I could overcome it, at least to a certain extent in some spaces with the argument.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the claim that I don't offer any solutions and that the book is too pessimistic is in part, I think, even an unconscious defense mechanism against the accuracy of what my argument is. Because what I end up advocating, whether I say it directly or not, is that we need to be doing things that are currently not being done. And we need to do things that are going to make people uncomfortable and are going to be harder than people making the individual choice to become more entrepreneurial or to claim that they support the circulation of the black dollar, which is, again, just a claim without a source or data to support it. So, in fact, I do offer a solution in the book. It's just that the solution isn't something that people want to focus on. And the solution, of course, that I advocate is that instead of making arguments around buying power, that the black community organize itself to advocate for public policy that calls for a redistribution of the wealth that's created in this country, that to target the gross domestic product, the actual GDP of the country. Stop comparing falsely, as I explain and demonstrate in the book, that buying power of the black community is the equivalent to a national GDP of another country. Stop doing that, because it's A, not true, and B, has nothing to do with addressing the inequality within the community, within a society. But again, that kind of political work is anathema to people who just want to make money, and is a real struggle for people who want to avoid engaging the state as it currently exists. And I'm talking about people on the left here who, and I understand this, in many ways I'm one of them, but people who don't want to engage the state in more conventional politics and just want the black community to do for self, and therefore try to put a positive spin on the buying power claim for some progressive purpose. My point is, there's nothing underneath the claim. There's no reality to the claim. So whether from a more left or a more right perspective, just broadly, very broadly speaking, the problem is in some ways the same, that neither in these cases, and by left, I really mean sort of liberal, mainstream, just Democratic Party liberal is what I would describe it as. Whether on that side or a more conservative side, the problem has been that they don't like my solution of targeting the GDP for redistribution, because really none of them want socialism or anything associated with even the word redistribution. So from the more progressive side, they'll, argue for safety nets, maybe in individual areas, healthcare, et cetera, or will just simply be satisfied with small business loans, as Kamala Harris was offering, and things of that nature. And of course, the conservatives want no form of federal intervention other than that which protects their right to dominate a so-called free market, which is anything but. So, but my point is that I do offer a solution, which is that public policy be advocated that targets a redistribution of the wealth that the entire society generates, and that is measured in GDP, which is, as I simplify, a measurement of the wealth created by all the exchange and the sale of goods and services, and that accrues to those who own the economy, which is, the 800 people worth $6.2 trillion, the 0.1% of 1%, et cetera, and so forth. And all of that is public policy protected. That's all law that says this is how wealth will be defined and created and distributed. And if we advocate for public policy that just says whether you're a business owner or a consumer, whether you're rich or poor, whether you are, however you define a go-getter or so-called lazy, all of us are producing all of this wealth. It should be better distributed to make sure that nobody is suffering in any kind of way. So that's the kind of public policy that I'm saying we should advocate for, in addition to other forms of grassroots political organization and radical engagement with the electoral political system. So it's not that I don't have solutions. It's that whether to the extent I describe them or define them properly or well enough in the book, which could be perhaps argued, that's not been the point. The point has just simply been to dismiss me as saying I don't have any solutions, which is also a way ultimately of also just avoiding the argument that I'm making, so that people can more safely return to the comfortable confines of what are the promoted or propagandized mythologies about self-help, individual choice, so-called financial literacy, black capitalism, and so on.
I've heard you state that your primary audience for the book isn't the masses necessarily, but activists and black media intermediaries who we've talked about as propagating the myth. Can you say more about why that is?
Well, I'm not actually sure I said it that exactly. So maybe there's some missing context. In general, what I've talked about in terms of media work has been a model that I've attributed to the late Glenn Ford of Black Agenda Report, who argued that his journalism and the journalism of that outlet was to target a certain segment of the black community that were the activists and organizers and journalists and academics, etc., who were involved with a certain politic and could use a form of journalism and a source of journalism that helped them do their work. But in terms of my book, it was specifically designed or intended to be accessible to everyone. Mm-hmm. And this is why even the first edition to this day is still available for free in digital form. So in that regard, I never meant to at least suggest that I didn't want as broad an audience as possible to read this book and engage it and be challenged by it. But yeah, it is also true that in terms of my media work more broadly, I've argued that we're not going to be able to produce media in a way that counterbalances the dominant form. And so other methods have to be developed to achieve the goals of the work that some of us are trying to do. But yeah, so anyway, I just hope that clarifies that point a little bit.
It does. Thank you. So now we get to questions that I ask every one of my guests. What songs got people on the dance floor when you were going out dancing or DJing? I don't know if you DJ.
I'm not a DJ. I've never been, I have used turntables and mixing equipment to create mixtapes and at times to attempt to rock a party, but I am not a DJ by any means. And I don't mean to disrespect that community, but you're asking when I was growing up, what got people?
Or maybe in the peak of when you were going out dancing.
Honestly, the first two things that come to mind are because I spent a lot of time in where I grew up in that area, in the DC area. Any go-go music got people up and dancing. But I would think in terms of like more popular, like It Takes Two by Rob Bass and Easy Rock for a time that seems to have that was always. But anything from I always go blank on the spot like this.
It's all good. It Takes Two is a staple of my middle school dances.
Yeah. But even some of the older stuff, that's what I was really trying to think of. Like, like Atomic Dog from P-Funk. Would always get people of my generation on the dance floor. And then, of course, all the various hip hop tracks that sampled that.
What is a Black cultural work? It could be anything, song, movie, book, poem, whatever, that is an absolute classic, but is underappreciated.
Well, for me, it's always Donny Hathaway's live double album, which to me is the greatest piece of music recorded and organized in any form ever in the history of all forms of music. So
high praise, but
I
get it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a quick go-to for me for a question like that.
Yeah. What particular dish did your family make that you looked forward to the most?
When I was growing up or now?
When you're growing, or now, both of them.
My mother made a kind of mean, spicy chicken and rice when I was growing up. That I liked. And now I get sort of, no disrespect to her, but a kind of better version than that with my wife. But it's all vegan now. So, oh man, she just made this may be recency bias, but she just made a new vegan quesadilla that I said immediately is in my top 3 meals of all time.
Wow.
So
okay.
I'll
Gotta give you that recipe.
Let me stick with that. Yeah. Yeah, I have no idea. All I know is it's vegan. And, but she killed it. And, so yeah, that's definitely it for now.
Dr. Ball, I really appreciate you speaking with me. Can you please tell the people where they can find you?
imixwhatilike.org and at imixwhatilike, all your relevant social media. And, yeah, and I'm not hard to find. And I appreciate the discussion. It's been great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Peace.
I would like to thank my guest again, Dr. Jared Ball, for the great, impassioned, lively discussion. You can find him at imixwhatilike.org. He's on all social media platforms, and he's extremely prolific. You will not miss a post by him. He's constantly putting out material, arguments, critique, ideas, interviews, etc. I have a number of takeaways from this episode. The most important one, I think, is that facts and logic are not enough to sway most people. I believe that is a liberal, enlightenment, rationalist fallacy and fantasy. That is not how most people operate in the world. People do not want to look stupid. They don't want to feel fooled. And so you will have a hard time separating people from their current beliefs, even if you are clearly right on the facts, as Dr. Ball is in this case, I believe, about Black buying power. I also took away from this that mainstream, top-down approaches to spreading ideas and changing culture are often quite successful, and I would like to learn from them, even though I'm obviously more aligned with grassroots, more democratized, decentralized avenues of culture building. I really do want to learn from mainstream efforts and what Dr. Ball would call, in his case, propaganda efforts, because they work. There is a caveat to that, though. In order to stick and have the people accept and perpetuate the ideas, even if it's top down, it has to resonate with people. And people need to get something out of it, too. In the case of Black buying power, I was suggesting that it's hope or empowerment. But it is clear to me that you cannot just put out anything, and just because you're putting it out, people are going to accept it. There have been many failed propaganda efforts that people were able to resist for various reasons. I really do hope you got something out of this episode. I know I did. As always, please like, subscribe, follow, and review on whatever platform you use to listen. And be on the lookout. The episodes will soon be up on YouTube. With that said, enjoy your week, and until next time.